Good morning. Let's get called to order. Thank you. Thank you for coming this morning. And I haven't had coffee, but you know that's my personality. I'm sorry if I'm screaming. I'm so excited to have this critics panel here. And we brought especially for you, critics from all over the country. Someone sent a question, why are there so many critics there? And I said, guess what? Roger was a critic, and I happen to love critics because they really do give you an insight into things that you don't see. People say now with the democratization of the internet that there's so much out there you have a choice, but yes, there's so much out there that it's overwhelming. So they curate things for you, they really give insight, they do lots of things that they're going to talk about today. And we're going to have as a moderator of the panel someone that we welcomed warmly yesterday with his movie, Godfrey, Cheshire, this morning. And because we have so many, and I want to give them a chance to talk, I'm just going to say their names. Michael Phillips from the Chicago Tribune, Sam Fragoso from Movie Mezzanine, Neil Minow from BeliefNet and MovieMom.com, Susan Wazina from USA Today, formerly a lot of things, RogerEbert.com, Scott Foundas from Variety, Matt Zolerseis from RogerEbert.com, as well as Vulture and New York Magazine. Who's on the other side of you? Oh, Rebecca Vachon, Theodore Vachon from Urban World Daily, Glenn Kinney, RogerEbert.com, formerly Premier, so many other publications. I can't see of you. Oh, Richard
Nice
Roper.
to meet you.
Hey. Yeah. Formerly of Ebert and Roper, Chicago Sun-Times, and a lot of other places. And Brian Tellerico, managing editor of RogerEbert.com, as well as lots of other things. So that's all. I'm going to turn it over to Godfrey. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be here as a critic today after having had such a good time as a filmmaker yesterday. I thank all of you all for coming out for this, and I'm really glad to have this large panel here of very interesting and distinguished critics. Matt Seitz and I were talking yesterday about what this would be like, how it could be done, and he suggested thinking of it as like a bunch of critics at the coffee house sitting around talking, and and you all listening in on our conversation, and then we'll invite you into it as well. So that's not a bad way to do it. We have so many people that I'm going to try to keep this and let people chime in rather than being too programmatic about it. I have a number of sort of areas I want to talk about, but I'll start off by saying that we mentioned already today, I wrote this piece in 1999 called The Death of Film, The Decay of Cinema, in which I was looking at what seemed to me a tidal wave of change about to sweep over what we called film, having to do with the removal of the technology of film from the whole audiovisual process, where the sort of the cultural and economic ramifications of that. And a lot of people have continued to discuss these articles, and I didn't get everything right by a long shot, but it raised a lot of questions that people thought were interesting at the time and have continued to do so. And I have a friend, David Bordwell, who I wish was here. He keeps a running count of the things that I got right, and I think it's in the upper 20s now. But I was thinking about this because it has been 15 years since the turn of the millennium. Matt Seitz did a 15th anniversary interview with me about these articles last year on Roger Ebert, which we have just reposted. So it's on the front page, as Matt says, of RogerEbert.com.
Keeping the 20th century here.
Yeah. So those things are things that we would want to talk about, but I do think, it's 15 years is a good enough time to look back and think come a good ways into this new era. A lot of things have changed, and yet some of the things that we as critics are concerned with aesthetically are very much the same issues, and it's just dealing with them as the circumstances change, because we are talking about, I guess the big topic for critics is film culture, of which individual films are manifestations. But when we talk about film culture, we're talking about kind of the intersection of the technology of film, the business of film, and the art of film. And those things are harder and harder to separate, I would say, in some ways. So we want to talk about those, and I'm gonna, in some cases, ask people to volunteer here to speak about. But otherwise, I want people to feel free to just jump in anytime they choose to. Let me ask somebody, all of you, a question first of all. How many of you tweet? Am I the only one up here that doesn't?
Hold on, I have to Vine and Insta that right away. You don't tweet.
I'm
You're so pure, Godfrey.
I'm
have
such
four
a
Twitter accounts.
Luddite that I always want to be the last kid on my block to have what I've just gotten an iPhone, right? It's like
I like to think of you as the monk for cinema.
you're not the first one to say that. But somebody was, so it's a kind of an exotic curiosity. Hearing people talk about it the other night. Sam, was it you saying that you thought tweets tended to be very negative?
I was quoting Brian, actually.
Well, Brian, you want to jump in on that?
I think lately I've seen a lot of what I would call knives sharpened tweets. People go into a movie with their knives sharpened, ready to come out and
Right.
and slice it up as wittily as they possibly can.
Right.
And I think that's diminished a little bit of the critical discussion and the critical rapport. By the same token, a lot of writers, myself included, probably aren't here without social media. So social media has its benefits as well, largely exposure. When
Right.
I started with small outlets in Chicago, I built a following and built a reputation by posting my stuff on Facebook and posting it on Twitter. So there's value in it as well. I just think, especially lately, there's been a lot of vitriol and snarkiness and general. Jason Segel was saying last night, just get off Twitter, don't read it, get off the internet, it's bad for you. And
Right.
I do think that there's some truth to that. I'd like to think it'll come around and that like the cream rises to the top kind of argument that some of the best, there's some good writing on Twitter. There's some really good writing on Twitter.
But unfortunately, it's a little bit like Gresham's law. The bad drives out the good, and there's this mean tweets. I mean,
Yep.
it's really too bad that Jimmy Kimmel is creating an incentive for people who say, I'm intentionally writing something really mean because maybe Angelina Jolie will read it on Jimmy
Absolutely.
Kimmel. And that gets retweeted. And John Ronson's new book really talks about this in great detail. You do get for a mean tweet. You know, I tweet out my reviews every week and my interviews and things like that, so that whether it's a good review, I gave a very good review to Ex Machina today, but you're right that it is very seductive to say something snarky, which comes naturally to all of us anyway, when we're critics. And,
Critics?
And that is it's more than a double-edged sword. It's sort of a triple edge with two edges bad.
Well, very quickly too. Sorry, Glenn. But by the way, Jimmy Kimmel's staff writes those tweets. But he actually does. They write those tweets. They're way too clever for just. But they still, I do think, encourage the mean tweets because people think that's real people writing them. I agree with Brian. I think it can be a great tool. I like to use Twitter and other social media to provide links for Ebertfest coverage. Go here for my review of this movie. Go here. I agree that you should not be reviewing the movie in 140 characters. I like to do something more, just give a little something, like a little supporting information. For example, the end of the tour, I thought it was cool that Becky Ann Baker, who played the mom of the two kids in Freaks and Geeks, had a little cameo as the woman who was at the bookstore. So obviously that's somebody that Jason Segel had worked with 15 years ago. So that, I'll tweet something like that, just like a little interesting nugget, but not a quick knee-jerk reaction to the film itself.
I like to say something positive about Twitter because
Okay.
you have the power, lady, right here. Because whenever you tweet one of my pieces, I get like 20 followers, okay? and it's not out of meanness or, they're legitimately that with your approval on it, even if it's on the website, if you particularly pick out a piece, people will read it. And I think, there's also that positive, it builds a community. And now, I was at USA Today, which had back then a big readership, but since going online exclusively, I've gotten so many more, people from all over, and it's not really mean there, for me, but I don't encourage that. But I do think there's a positive, and the outlets that are more traditional are going away. You have to join the club a little bit.
Well, it's a survivalist. You're trying to tweet something that gets attention, especially for right community who have lost jobs recently. You're trying to get attention. You tweet something that gets retweeted because it's clever and snarky, but not necessarily artistically valid or critical. You're going to get more attention and hopefully further your career. But it's a, like I said, double, triple, quadruple-edged sword.
For better or worse, all social media platforms present writers with tools, and it's up to the writer how they use the tool, how they propagate the tool. And it's very easy to complain and talk and bemoan the low character of social media and the culture it's engendered, and it's actually tougher to create an alternative or to create a positive manifestation of it.
Right.
It's tougher in economic controversy or being provocative or that kind of thing, which is not necessarily true. But you know, I've been a writer professionally for over 30 years, and I started out at a paper called The Village Voice that at the time was very well respected for being a writer's paper. Few outlets nowadays that even want as writers' outlets, and even those, you know, you have these websites like Longform that approach the idea of a over 5,000 word article as something strange and foreign and bizarre, and what an exotic thing this is that we have this 5,000 word article. And you know, when the internet started, I remember I was at a magazine called Premiere that did pretty well until it didn't, and I remember, you know, as far back as 1997, my boss and I, Jim Meggs, were talking to the guys upstairs and saying, we have to address the new media situation, and they'd be like, what? And then like 2005, they'd literally say, you know, what's a blog? And then 2 years later, it's like, hey, how's that blog coming along? It's like, guess what, guys, we're too late on this. And it was kind of infuriating because, you know, you had the chance in that world to sort of help shape the culture, and a lot of people just didn't do that. So, you know, I think, you know, it's you know, and I like a good wisecrack as much as the next guy, and I enjoy the aphoristic possibilities that Twitter affords one. That being said, it's, you know,
You just used up all 140 characters. with
well,
that
you know,
email.
it's tough, you know, and that's why ampersand.
Glenn, let me jump in here and ask, to turn this related kind of question or issue.
I was gonna sing, though, Godfrey.
This is
gonna
this has
sing,
to do
man.
with the volume of films that are coming at us as critics all the time. I mean, I think this has been increasing for many years, and I felt like last year I was thinking to myself at one point, well, you know, they're more and more, but I feel like I get to see most of the ones that I really need to see, so that I have a picture of what's going on and I can do my 10 best list and all that kind of thing. This year I feel like I may have reached a tipping point because there are films out there that I know about that I don't get to see, that are open and closed, and there's no time to go back and all of that. One thing, the reason I relate this to social media is if you're a critic and you want to keep up with the things that you think you ought to know about, how do you know which those things are? Yeah. I do depend somewhat on social media for that, like on Facebook, where my critic friends, my millions of critic friends on Facebook, say things. That sounds like I should see that film.
There's an interesting side note. Manola Dargis of the New York Times, who's not a tweeter, got kind of pilloried on social media for articulating something that a lot of us might think but not actually say out loud, which is a lot of movies, and maybe too many of them.
Right.
You know, which is, you know, you have this one, Let 1,000 Flowers Bloom in this new era of digital filmmaking, but it's a crushing amount of stuff to with.
Well,
Matt and Brian are editors. I'd like perspective is on this and trying to cover this stuff on RogerEbert.com.
We publish, oh, I'm sorry. But just for the record, we publish maybe 500 to 600 new film reviews a year.
Yeah.
So there you go.
And I was going to say, this topic and the previous topic in a weird way is this idea of an echo chamber. I am on Twitter. I, like other people who are on Twitter, spend a fair amount of time thinking about what is Twitter. And like Facebook, strange, it is you private a lot of the time because you are communicating, you do most of your communication with people that you talk to all the time. And once in a while you talk to somebody you've never talked to before. And if you are talking to people, the same people over and over, who are basically your friends, I distinguish between my virtual friends and my in real life friends, they're just all my friends. This echo chamber effect happens where, and I've had this happen to me many times, where I feel like I'm hearing relentlessly negative things about a particular movie that I haven't seen yet, and I'll say, gosh, such and such a movie sure isn't well liked by the critics, and then I'll get a flood of people who don't normally communicate with me going, I loved it. And so it's like the the parable of the 7 or 8 blind men, the elephant, trying to describe it. Like, you're not getting a complete picture of film culture. And Godfrey, what you were just saying about, and Glenn, films out there, are there too many films? Am I missing films that I should be seeing? There's something like Twitter that were a little more, a bigger umbrella, I guess you would say, like a Twitter where you can get outside of Twitter somehow. I don't know, maybe there's a next level up. Because, we get locked in these subjective bubbles, and we make wrong assumptions, and I wonder if it's reflected in how we write about film.
Matt, am I remembering correctly that you got into a fight on Twitter with somebody about
Yes.
how much
Oh, no, I'm
actresses
sorry, no.
get paid? About how much actresses get paid and whether they're overpaid?
Yeah, actually, and I said, my opinion was, and this is because I have a lot of actor friends, but...
I should say with an idiot. I mean, the person
Yeah,
you were, yeah.
yeah, it was, and
I'm
I...
right here
redundant
now.
on Twitter, but-
Just kidding.
Yeah, I basically was saying I get really tired of hearing, and it's not just critics, it's everybody saying, actors are paid too much, actresses are paid too much, such and such a person got $5 million or $10 million or $20 million to be in a movie. It's like, okay, first of all, they worked their entire life to get to this point. There's a lot of things they made where they got underpaid or probably not paid at all. I've done some books on filmmakers and had opportunities to go through their files, and I found like notices from bill collectors and things. So basically, okay. And we don't say that about almost anybody else in any field of the arts because we don't hear about how much they make. But anyway, that was, yeah. But I get into that, yeah. I get into a fight about something every 2 days on Twitter. I have a sticker on my computer that says "Do not engage." I actually
That's my policy.
Let me
I
ask.
don't read it as much as I should.
Let me get a couple of people that haven't spoken yet, namely Scott Foundas and Michael Phillips, and ask them. You both prominent sort of film critic platforms in prominent publications. How does all this? How is the volume of films affecting you, and how do you think it's affecting the culture? And does this have anything to do with social media in your case, in terms of how you deal with the volume?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're in the position, Variety has sort of always, in its conception, the idea was always to review every film that surfaces anywhere in the world because it's a trade publication. Not that really means much in the digital age because everybody reads everything and we don't have a paywall anymore. But, we still review movies when they premiere at a festival or when they screen publicly somewhere for the first time as opposed to when they open in cinemas. And that means there's just even more movies to potentially write about. I mean, the Tribeca Film Festival last night, there's, probably upwards of 50 or 60 movies screening there that we haven't already written about, and we simply can't get to all of them. So you, in a way, it feels like you're in quicksand, and you're just always trying to keep your nose above the horizon because you miss the movie at one festival, you try to catch up with it at the next one, and so forth and so on. Really don't get to everything anymore. And one of the interesting things I think about the New York Times is that they don't get to everything anymore either. The New York Times, which used to pride themselves to be the paper of record, at least for all movies that open commercially in New York, no longer reviews all movies that open commercially in New York. And they didn't make an announcement about it, but if you look on Friday of the 20 to 30 new movies that are opening every week, they may review 15 of them. And how they make those choices, I don't know. But I think really that's where the internet and social media come into this, is the only real paper of record anymore is the internet, because there is no one outlet that's being comprehensive in its coverage of all of the movies made in the world every year.
Michael?
Yeah, I'd say the whole notion of paper of record is truly 20th century. It just doesn't. This is not that world. We don't live in a world where we're looking for one source for every.
There's no paper.
Was saying something that we're in competition not just with other papers in our city, but we're in competition with every publication in the country and around the world, and every blog, and every message board, and every Facebook page. Yeah, and it all happens at once. There's no such thing as a scoop anymore. If somebody gets an exclusive, like 5 seconds later, it's not an exclusive.
Well,
Yeah, I mean,
And it's
I
not
started my
credited.
career, at too young an age at a weekly in Minneapolis, and I just was sort of guilt-racked every week about the people you disappointed by not covering something. I was an arts editor then, and I just was like, it was tough to shake it off. Like how many down every week, not covering them. Some of that feeling has come back recently on the job 30 years later at this job, in that, it's essentially me, no freelance, no budget, wire access to the LA Times, which is, at least for a few months more, part of our business model. And so the notion of any kind of complete coverage is out the window. But I think that way lies kind of mediocrity anyway. I think if you're really on the scramble to just simply cover the waterfront like a maniac, I don't know. It's a different, again, that doesn't belong to this world anymore.
So Michael, how do you make those decisions? Is there, I mean, obviously you're not going to forego the some independent film, but are there times when you really reach out to make sure that some
We do.
gem is
No, honestly, the trick, you cannot set up false choices for yourself or for your, never get in the, this is so condescending, I'm just going to say it. Being a critic wherever I've worked has meant a lot of insidious psychological self-training about how to train your editor. Just about, kind of, always nod and agree, and then you're already thinking of the alternative in your head or whatever, but it's not, you cannot, you have to kind of constantly reassert the importance of a really healthy and wide ecosystem for what you're covering. You can't the film you really believe in that 14 people are going to see. I mean, in broad terms, versus the eventual. And I'm not saying, I know you wouldn't make that case either, but it's. If you start missing the things that really mean something to you, or you start feeling like you really aren't your job is such that you don't have the time to exercise your curiosity and find out if that thing was worth seeing. Then you really are. Then you got problems.
I was going to say, it's really, really one of the wonderful things about social media generally is people like, for example, Rebecca. I love to read what Rebecca posts because she has such incredibly broad interests, like all sorts of television, all sorts of movies, and there are many, many times where, and she's on a list of people who I read because, not just because she's enjoyable, but also because there's a very good chance she's going to make an incredibly cool thing that I haven't heard of, and then I seem really cool knowing about it. So, there's that benefit as well.
But that is now dependent on getting clicks.
Getting what?
Clicks.
Okay.
That's what rules much of, what is left of, media outlets who do things with film. And I think there's also this rush to spoil. Everybody's, and it's not just, preview, and the marketing is all about that too, because they do in dribs and drabs. And I was thinking during the Harold Ramis tribute that I saw Animal House. The only thing I knew about it was that John Belushi was in it. And I didn't, and so when I went in, it was like, I got such a bang. I mean, I don't think I ever experienced that again with a comedy, that the whole place was insane. And I don't think you can do that anymore, because by the time you see the Avengers, you probably know, pretty much what's going to happen and what the highlights are, and what they're wearing, what their underpants look like. I mean, everything. And you can't be surprised anymore, because it's all about who gets the scoop first and exclusive. And it doesn't even mean anything.
What was the name of that Alien prequel that came out a couple of years ago?
Prometheus.
Thank you, of course.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, so Prometheus comes out. I was thinking the other day, Prometheus, I should watch that again. That was a pretty good movie. And then I remembered I saw that movie the movie that much. I was thinking of the trailers.
Yeah, the marketing for that was amazing.
The movie in my mind was
Yeah.
one of the greatest
Yeah.
films ever made in the history of cinema. The movie itself was like, it had
Yeah.
its good and bad points, but in my mind. But that's something like what you're talking about.
I want to shift over to talking about what's on screens in a big way. And this gentleman over here running the camera in the black T-shirt asked a question at the end of the last panel that I really liked. He said, "What comes after the superhero bubble bursts?" And I said, "Well, it might not burst." in
Sweet
your
relief for
lifetime."
many of us.
What's that?
Sweet relief for many.
Sweet relief. But I did.
I like superhero movies.
I did mention that our friend Mark Harris wrote a piece in Grantland recently, sort of saying that the studios are projecting out many years of the mushrooming superhero franchises that they have, and that they intend to dominate everything for many years to come. What's your perspective? I mean, this, it seems like, inevitably crowds out anything that's not a superhero movie.
It's out. Women directors, I wrote about that. Women directors aren't allowed apparently to, superhero movies. Wonder Woman, they had a woman director. I don't know.
Now they
she
have
went
another one.
away.
They have another one now.
I'll tell you the
Okay.
problem with that. I wrote a profile action filmmakers
Yes.
alive right now, and those they subcontract the action scenes to second units and special effects houses. So, and I haven't spoken to her about this, but I would not be hugely surprised if one of the reasons she left was that she couldn't really do the thing that they hired her to do,
But
which is a problem with these movies.
I mean, women do like you, but I think it crowds out other voices. At least this summer is actually not too bad with female-driven movies, so this might be.
Well, they reserve the first weekend in August
then,
every year
for
for a Meryl Streep picture.
all these why no, I love that. That's great.
Yeah.
No, she took the Harrison Ford spot.
That's
What I
right, yeah.
love. He used to be August.
Yeah,
so-
he's coming at Christmas.
Yeah, right.
Really,
The whole tenor
no.
of what we're talking about, though, kind of brings up an interesting question, which is, in this age of the various plagues that we're in, what is the distinction between being a film critic and being an industry analyst? Because I think that there is, and there absolutely should be, a distinction. And to what extent are we practicing journalism? What extent are we practicing criticism? I mean, we could break it down in a lot of different ways. I saw, the superhero model is the business model for the foreseeable future for the large studios. They like their rides, they like their franchises. This is the closest thing they've come to having something they can actually bank on that will give a reliable return on investment on a consistent basis for the next 20 years. There's the smaller model, and I saw a film the other day that was produced by the Duplass brothers, who are these, young indie filmmakers who have a show on HBO. They do films about relationships, films about characters, and and it was an okay movie. And I'm thinking, like, this is going to be the alternative to tentpole superhero movies, just this like relentlessly average stuff.
well, and
you know?
everything in between is going to be gone.
Yeah,
What's
so the
really- yeah.
radical stuff, the innovative stuff, that's going to get crowded out closer.
It's gonna go to
in the
TV.
margins.
It's
But
moving to
Yeah,
television.
yeah.
It's going to
It's moving
television.
Right.
That's
there's
where
nothing.
that's where
There's
the
good
thoughtful
quality work
start
on
right.
television, but there's very little that's actually radical or
Oh, yeah, I agree.
formally, revolutionary on television. And that is, so again, are we industry analysts or are we critics? Are we looking for art and are we writing about art, or are we like, spotting trends being, kind of swept along with them?
Well, they influence each other. I mean, when the mid-budget film, what's getting crowded out is the mid-budget film, the $20-30 million movie. I spoke to William H. Macy a couple of years ago and asked him why he was doing so much TV, and he said, because I can't get movies made. It's either really small, low budget, or it's $200 million Avengers movies. The mid-budget film, like Steven Soderbergh made for years, that's going away. That's getting harder and harder to get financed.
Well, another thing about the superhero movies, and I agree, I mean, a lot of them are really well done, but as someone who has seen, all of these, when Downey Jr. and Jeremy Renner and Mark Ruffalo, every time they commit to one of these movies, that's one mid-budget movie that a Robert Downey Jr. can get made just by having his name attached to it. Hugh Jackman has played Wolverine 13 times. Pacino played Michael Corleone 3 times. I don't think we need to know any more nuances of Wolverine at this point.
But that takes care of itself. Not every superhero movie makes money. Some of them tank, and anybody who saw that leaked trailer of Superman versus Batman knows that doesn't look so good.
Well, I always come back, there was Pauline Kael wrote a great piece with lots of foresight back in 1981 when she had just come back to the New Yorker after her year as a story editor at Paramount called Why Are Movies So Bad, or The Numbers. And she talked in there about that already the studios were sort of looking for these, you know, audience-tested models, that the executives were now people who came from agencies and from TV rather than people with a real a rooting in cinema and a love of cinema. And she talked, the executive will be rewarded for following all the rules and making a big budget movie that plays by all the rules, even if it doesn't make money, but they'll be punished for making a small risk-taking movie that the studio doesn't know what to do with. Her example at the time was Breaking Away, the Peter Yates bicycling movie, which Fox never really got behind, even after it was nominated for Oscars and all that kind of thing. And I think you read that, and it feels like an article written 3 hours, 30 years ago. I think the plus side is that there are still some people making these mid-budget movies, but they're all in the independent realm. It's all of these. I wrote an article last year called "The Daughters of Billionaires" that was about Megan Ellison, Gigi Pritzker, and Molly Smith, who all have these companies that are basically making the kind of movies that the studios used to make and they don't make anymore. And even as much as we may love to hate him at times, has practically carved out a specialty field releasing those kind of movies. I mean, what are movies like The Imitation Game and August Osage County and The King's Speech, but movies that would have been the big Christmas movie of Paramount or Universal or Fox in the 80s.
Right, right.
There's also too much, I think, they don't put a premium on being original anymore. Everything used to make films that were original.
Right.
Now their whole production line, it's either a Marvel, it's a Star Wars, it's a sequel.
And remake. They're going to do a
Pinocchio.
live-action Dumbo.
And Winnie the Pooh as well.
And who is going to play Dumbo? That's what I want to know.
I hope it's Paul Giamatti.
Yes, that I would see.
I don't want any more peanuts. Not enough.
Pink elephants on parade.
There's been a lot of talk in the last year, so especially about the place of women and minorities in film now, and how the numbers are so dismal in a lot of ways, both behind the camera and on screen. And there's also been comparison made to TV that there's more diversity on TV and more opportunity in TV. What are your thoughts on that, especially in terms of, since we're supposedly film critics, where we're going in terms of film? Rebecca, you want to jump in on that?
Well, I actually wrote a piece for the New York Times last year talking about how, as far as actresses of color, and particularly women over 50, like when you look at The Good Wife or Scandal, like Kerry Washington, or Davis has been in the business for almost 2 decades, right? And I mean, as far as the big schools, we're more supportive. And Meryl Streep has gone on record saying that she's probably one of the greatest living actresses today, but it would take someone like Shonda Rhimes to see the value of Viola Davis. From what I remember, she was watching an Oprah special, and Viola said that, you know, the only roles she gets are crackhead mothers or some sort of suffering or pathological role. And she was like, they would never cast me as the love interest. They would never see me as sexy. And Shonda was like, I'm gonna give you that role. So at the time, that's when they were looking at How to Get Away with Murder, and they gave her the role, you know. So I do think, as far as the small screen, on an average day, I can see people who look like myself, and I think for others, as far as the LGBT community, and again, women over see themselves, and not just as the supportive mother. Because I think I saw, what was it, Divergent last year? Yeah. And Ashley Judd, and I'm like, wait a minute, she's playing the mom. Is she that old? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, this is a woman who was just like, who came on the scene, and I think she's, you know, a very fine actress, but I just thought that that was kind of strange. But then again, the whole YA, you know, genre is geared towards, you know, it's more youth-oriented. But I think TV has different types of stories. I'm in a Daredevil hangover because I stayed up till 3 watching it, and I was just like, this is not anything. Well, I mean, the violence is ridiculous. I mean, but yeah, but I do think it's a game changer. But I think it's kind of changing the storyline, and particularly because it's set in New York. I think one of my gripes is shows that are set in New York. It's not the New York that. Well, I love New York, Sex and the City. It was just too whitewashed. I was just like, where are the people of color? Whereas in Daredevil, it's such a diverse, you know, story, and the way that they use the New York City landscape I think that's what people are looking for. They're looking for different types of things. And I think while I'm happy for Age of Ultron, I will be watching it, it's still lily white for the most part. I mean, you still have, now they've upped 2 superheroes. Now you have Scarlet Witch and Black Widow. And
Yeah, I think there is a relationship between what we're talking about now is
Yeah.
superheroes are supposed to be Batman and Superman, right? And they, that model, you know, they can throw in,
Right.
you know, a black or an Asian or a woman. It's tokenism, though. It's because the
Exactly.
form itself demands a thing that it is probably never going to change.
There's
Yeah.
a few Koreans in Age of Ultron because they had co-production money from Korea and shot part of the movie there. That's always a great incentive for diversity.
That's
Well,
my
that
that's
was
my
like
tip for
Transformers,
screenwriters.
they went
Yeah,
there.
my
Yeah,
daughter.
China, yeah.
My daughter's a costume designer in Hollywood, and she worked on a movie that was financed in part by China on the condition that they changed her to be of Chinese ethnicity and changed the storyline with 2 extra scenes for playing in China.
The third Iron Man movie didn't have an entire section that American audiences never saw. where,
Yeah,
like,
but-
he has to go to China to get new blood or something.
Supposedly that was actually rejected by the Chinese audience because they knew that was just put there
They were
as a
pandering.
token. So the mod more like the Transformers, where it's those roles are more integrated into the story, and the movie is the same version everywhere in the world. But China is definitely the new frontier for all kinds of reasons.
Sniper's fake baby is Chinese in China.
There's a funny story from the beginning of Martin Scorsese's film career where he had this script that was an autobiographical script called Mean Streets, which was set in Little Italy, an Italian-American milieu, and this was during a period where Shaft and the genre that was known as blaxploitation was pretty prominent. And Roger Corman said to Scorsese, you know, I think I can make your film if you can just swing it and make all the characters black. And Scorsese was like, and he thought about it, you know, because he really wanted to make the film. He says, I just can't see these characters like hanging out in Catholic churches and being really guilt-ridden. You know? So he said, you know, because it was his own life, his own friends that he was making the film about. He stepped back, and Corman put some money into the film anyway. But that was, you know, that was the directive then was completely the opposite of what we've seen so much these days.
The best thing I saw last year for women was Olive Kitteridge, which I thought if it was in the 80s, they would have made that into some fabulous film with some fabulous woman. And they just, you know, but on the other hand, I'm glad they did do an HBO because you got more. You know, they spread it out.
That was-
you
that
know.
I remember
that
talking
was
to Elisa Cholodenko, the
Yeah,
director.
it was all women, the writer.
But
and-
just to
yeah.
hear the process of when she went through right after the economy tanked in '07 to get the financing for The Kids Are All Right, who remembers that?
Yeah.
I mean, it took years and years to get a few $1 million together for that. It's just telling filmmakers to get the hell out, you know. And if it takes that long, to get to that many months and years of your life to not get the financing, then what is up? And can I ask one thing? I'd like to know if anybody, and I have not thought this through at all, this weird sort of paradox, Twitter and social media and all these factors in our lives as and as audiences that are kind of shredding our attention spans, right? At the same time, we're in this weird golden age of long-form binge watching, which leaves the film industry out in the cold. You know, you don't binge watch. I mean, you know, unless you all the Transformers movies in IMAX, or just kill yourself. You know, there's no that simply doesn't apply to the conventional movie-going life. But
Now is the time to
TV has
remarket Bellatar's
episodes.
Satan Tango.
But
You get so close to these characters that, you know, you live with them, especially if you binge watch. You feel like you've lived with Kevin Spacey and Robin Wright. You know, it's like it's a whole different thing than just watching. Still, I would say going into a movie theater, you still have a whole different experience than watching it on your phone or your watch or whatever you
I think the key
watch.
is control.
I don't think quantity equates to quality, and I'm going to dare to be optimistic here. I think the studios are behind, not us. And a movie that proves that is Beyond the Lights last year, a movie that did incredibly well. And she too suffered. And she spent years, the studio said, well, you know, maybe you can cast a white male lead. to play. And I interviewed her, and she did for the site, actually. And people are interested in stories, no matter, good stories, no matter race. And it's the studios that seem to be 5 steps behind. And I think slowly they're catching up to us. But it's going to take time and more conversations like this, and hopefully not all thrown in one Twitter conversation.
That was the best romance that came out last year, hands down, but I don't think it did incredibly well.
I don't think the marketing was good
Yeah.
either.
Yeah.
She's someone who, I mean, she was on Instagram, she was on Twitter, she interacted with anyone.
No, she
who
really
wrote-
got out there,
It-
but
it
the
did do
studio
pretty well. I
has-
mean,
well,
By what standards? Yeah, it didn't make as much as a superhero film, but these things never do.
I
One
think the
would,
great-
one
the
would
great
hope that
proof-
these services like Netflix that encourage binge watching and stuff. So we watch 13 hours of Daredevil, and then maybe we look around and we find a documentary or an indie film. Netflix is in a position now to really help push people towards these smaller films, to guide the conversation in a way. They don't have any Marvel films on Netflix. I know. I checked for my 5-year-old. There's none there. But they do have hundreds of documentaries. Hundreds. And I know people who have caught up on tons of documentaries through Netflix. We do a piece every 2 weeks where we point people to small films that have recently been put on Netflix. So I do, we talk about Netflix and TV and film being in a really powerful position to guide the conversation, and that's just one of many ways I think they are now.
Also, because they're not dependent on the opening weekend. You know,
Right.
people were wondering, there was a big story a couple of months ago when Netflix pre-bought the new Cary Fukunaga movie for $12 million, outbidding all of the theatrical distributors like Sony Classics and Fox Searchlight. But they can do that because they're only interested in keeping up their subscriber base. So
Which they
it's
don't
a
even
totally
reveal.
different model for them. It's like
Right.
HBO. As long as people keep coming, you know, they don't have the model that the movie studios do. They can shift the conversation.
And because they're free to do so, analysis. Like, there's no box office figures
Right.
released on Twitter. There's no ratings. Like, we don't necessarily know how many people watched House of Cards, which keeps it more about House of Cards than the numbers, which is true
It's
in
the
film.
same thing. I mean, this is a sort of a side issue, but it's the same thing with Turner Classic Movies. The one thing on the planet that everybody seems to love, and there's a reason they don't. There's no ratings, and I was
And a
fortunate.
lot of Barbara Stanwyck. You
Right.
can never have enough Barbara Stanwyck.
No, I was fortunate enough to do a couple of months over the last couple of years, and I just the level of anxiety in the room that seemed to attend almost every kind of TV or venture was not there. It was like walking into the MacArthur Foundation. You know, It was just everybody had worked there 23 years. You know, nobody was sweating anything.
And one hopes Netflix uses this opportunity. I wrote a piece a year and a half ago about how they could really push film and do all kinds of things because if it fails or succeeds. Like, they put a horror show out there that no one watches, we won't know, we'll move on to the next one 2 weeks. Whereas if you put out a horror film that flops, Robert Downey Jr. is in a horror film that flops, that's the headline. Or a TV show gets canceled, that's the headline.
And we
Netflix
should-
doesn't have to worry about that.
We should mention Amazon too.
Amazon.
Parent. You know, they obviously have that same model.
Yeah.
They also have a great built-in audience that's coming there to buy toilet paper, books, toothbrushes.
Right. I want to open it up in just a moment to the audience here for your questions, but I want to get into one more area before we do that, which is the state of film philia among younger viewers, 20-somethings and below. Sam, I'm looking at you. But, you know, my experience on this, or observations, just very anecdotal. I taught a course in history of film at the University of North Carolina when I was making movie Midway, and I was very struck by how bright the students were and how interested they were in a lot of film culture. But when I was at the same school, there were 2 theaters on the main drag there, you know, literally yards away from most of the dormitories, and I was there every night. That's where I saw, you know, Taxi Driver and The Passenger and all these things. These students would just not walk across the street to see a movie in the theater. They just didn't do that. That was not their culture. And the other side, but the other side of the coin was at the New York Film Festival around the same time. I met a young guy from North Carolina, like 19 years old, who had come up. He wanted to see Kiarostami speak, and he wanted me to autograph his Criterion collection of the. And I said, "How do you know about this?" And he said, "Oh, the Criterion collection. Me and all my friends like devour the Criterion, all the essays." And I was like, "Wow, that's pretty impressive." So there's just the modes of it are changing, is my impression. Sam, time for you.
Well, represent young people here. Look, I think speaking broadly and generally about young people is going to be tough to do, but in my experience, people are still interested in, and Criterion has made that possible, Netflix has made that possible, and the writing done on sites like RogerEbert.com guide people there, Dissolve, AV Club, you know, these places, there is an audience still, and that trying out and finding a filmmaker like Kiarostami or rediscovering Truffaut or Godard, that hasn't changed, and I don't envision it changing anytime soon.
Well, when I was in college many years ago, that it was a minority of people. There was, you felt like there was a certain excitement among people one knew.
But there's always
It's probably always
it's
that
always
way.
going to be a minority.
Right.
I mean, the reality is most people are not going to see Goodbye to Language. And we're lucky here to watch it. Most people are not going to dive into the work of Truffaut, but Hulu Plus especially makes that because they have all the Criterion films, or most of them. So yeah, okay.
I was going to say, one of the great things about all these platforms is, back in the day, whether it was a Blockbuster or the Last Picture Show or anything, it would play in the theaters, and it would maybe play for 6 months, which they never do now, and then it would go away. The movie would go away, and if it was a huge movie, Gone with the Wind was re-released every 3 years for 35 years.
Yeah.
But in most cases, the movie would just go away, and then maybe when Blockbuster could rent it on video, and then one day it would show up on your late night TV. And now a film, even if it doesn't find an audience, because there's 18 new movies coming out, if it's on video on demand, they still live. These films still live on. And so if you're 16 or 18 or 22 and you live in Effingham or you live in Juneau, Alaska, and you might not have access to a theater that has these, you can still, the library of films is so much exponentially larger than it was like when I wanted to find movies when I was 16.
Absolutely.
Is really great. I remember when I was a cinephile, starting out in the 80s when I was in high school, my best friend was a guy who really expanded my horizons, and he had video magazines, and in the back there would be classifieds from people, and it was just like, like if you're trying to get a date, except it was all about movies, and it was like looking for a copy of such and such a movie with this scene in it, and you would write them and say, yes, I have it, what do you have? And they would tell you what they had, and you would send them your thing, and they would send them your thing, and it was this crazy barter system. And now, of course, you can do it instantly online, but my point is that you don't have to work as hard to find those people. Like, it's not like you're pushing a boulder up a hill anymore. Like, they're out there away from you, which is amazing. And I just think how much I would have watched, how much faster I would if this had existed when I was 17, 18.
There was this great samizdat kind of system in the early days of home video where movie buff dudes who were very well socialized would like go through the local TV listings of surrounding towns, and if they'd see a film of particular interest that was in the library of a local television station, they'd put their VCR in the trunk, they'd drive out of state, they'd get a room in a motel, they'd hook the VCR up to the television, they'd tape the thing. That was how I first saw the great cult noir movie Blast of Silence. My friend Michael Weldon, who was the author of the Psychotronic Encyclopedia of Film, had a Betamax copy of it that was gotten just that way off of a TV station outside of Cleveland or something. And now that film is in the Criterion Collection.
Were the ads in the movie?
No, the guy was very, very,
Right.
he was very precise. He cut out all the
Okay.
ads. He was
We
It's
need
too
to
bad,
open
'cause
it up to
sometimes
the.
the ads are as good as the movie.
I went to the Library of Congress in search of a film that's never been on DVD that I wanted to write about, and they're very good about getting you the 16 millimeter print and playing it for you. They're wonderful. It's great. But in this particular case, the librarian said, I think I know where you get an illegal DVD of it. And she was right, and I did.
Okay, we need to stop and let the audience chime in here. And so there's a microphone right here. Anybody that wants to ask a question, please hie thyself to the microphone. Yes, sir.
Hi, guys. This question's mostly, it's a two-part question. First for Richard and Michael, because I grew up reading you guys in the Chicago area as well as Roger, of course. I'm just curious, so many years ago, there were your guys' voices in film criticism and a handful of others. And now there are maybe thousands that you're competing with. I'm curious if that changes your job. And my second question for anyone, I guess from writing for print to digital, as I know a lot of you have, you're not really dealing with column inches anymore. I'm curious as to how that's changed your approach as well. Thanks.
Well, I mean, it's made it easier in some ways because Chicago's in happily good shape with Roger, just in terms of really intelligent sort of a spectrum of coverage from RogerEbert.com and The Dissolve, just to name two that were there, X number of years ago in this way. So I like that. It's not. I don't even look at it as it's not competition. It's just simply it's a way of alleviating my guilt if I don't cover it myself. So but we can't. Nobody here is really able to kind of think of, well, whatever worked last year or last quarter or last month. We'll cover this week the same way. It just doesn't really work like that. We're all kind of as to how to use the digital component of the paper most effectively. Print is half of my newspaper will tell you, the managers will tell you, print is irrelevant. Screw it, let's just concentrate on it. Well, because 81% of the advertising is still coming from print, so there's a lot of let's say creative friction going on right now in the paper, and you just have to try to learn how to do it all. But that's the thing that's changed the most for me personally, is that this idea of actually being, I'm very passive aggressive on Twitter anyway. I don't tweet much, but it's mostly just for links. But to be able to do that, which is fascinating, sort of short form, and then occasionally do a podcast for an hour and a half and see if you can actually sustain your own interest in the topic for an hour and a half, let alone anybody else's, and then everything you've been doing, it's that kind of a new stew for me, and I like that. So I love that Chicago's really got it going.
Richard?
Well, I think one of the things that you have to remember as a critic, and I try to remember, is like, and Glenn mentioned, it's great that you can have places where there are 5,000-word essays, but just because you have unlimited real estate on your blog or anywhere else, you still have to practice the discipline as a writer, and it's in mind with their ever increasingly short attention span. So I don't really change the way I write because there are more people writing, or because I have more room. What I love, as Michael mentioned too, is and I came up, and I know some other people did here, as a reporter covering news, and it would be so frustrating when you'd see a movie and you'd file your review, and Laura Emmerich, who was Roger's editor for forever, and mine as well, and then we'd have to wait for it to get in print. And the wonderful thing now is you can see a movie and go home and write the review and hit a button and share it with everybody, and I love that aspect.
And you can fix your errors real quickly.
What errors? What do you mean?
Susan doesn't make any errors. No.
Okay.
That's
The next question.
As a writer, in the end, all you've got is that thing. If you have one, and
Yes,
you
sir.
just use it according to.
First of all, thank all of you for being here. And my question is, growing in the last 5, maybe 10 years, sort of the go-to reference, more casual film viewers is, this movie has X amount of rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Or, a new movie comes out, they're like, oh, it's got 95% on Rotten Tomatoes, it's got 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. I feel like that's sort of a double-edged sword where we have this algorithm of, oh, it's got a 100%, so I probably won't be disappointed. Most people liked it, so that's positive. But on the other hand, it's like 100% of critics like this, but they're all like, I guess you can go see it. Like, they may not have loved it. So I was just wondering how you would be top critics on Rotten Tomatoes, how you really feel about that sort of phenomenon of that is one of the most referenced ideas of why you should go see a movie or not go see it.
I think the danger with Rotten Tomatoes is, and we use it for my site and most publications I've written for it, the problem is people don't read the reviews.
Yeah.
They read the 140 or whatever, how many characters blurb that sometimes it's just 3 words. It's some snarky line or some funny line, and that's fine. It's funny, and I like humor, but people don't read the reviews. And I would urge people to not only read, but to maybe disregard Rotten Tomatoes. I think if a movie sounds interesting to you, you should go and see it, and then go back to the reviewer.
Aggregation is the enemy of the individual. at the end of Nabokov's Invitation to a Beheading, the protagonist goes towards something that he hears where he can find beings akin to him. And when I was growing up as a reader, I read a lot of criticism and essays, and I would always, there were people I would gravitate towards because I felt with them. There were, particularly in music, there was a guy, Picarella, who championed bands like Television and the Feelies, and I really liked his work, and I really liked how he described the music, and it got me into things that I wouldn't have gotten into otherwise. So when you find that, the writer who you have an affinity with, not necessarily that you always agree with him, although, growing up, Jim Hoberman was a great hero of mine, and I really realized I only found my true critical voice when I realized I could disagree with him without guilt or feel myself. But that's the thing about Rotten Tomatoes, is that it's a very handy takeaway tab. But the part of what's fun about criticism is finding a critic with whom you have whose writing you like, who makes you laugh, who you can kind of engage in a virtual dialogue with, even if you're not actually speaking to him. So it's unfortunate.
I'll defend Rotten Tomatoes briefly. I was working at a very small outlet. We got in Rotten Tomatoes. Our film review traffic doubled. So I, to a certain extent, I might not be here without Rotten Tomatoes, used as a portal. Maybe back in the older days, before Twitter was so popular, I think more people did use it as a portal. They did use it to find reviews and read the reviews instead of the snippets. And so I think if people use it that way, find writers they like Glenn said, find people they agree with. And for some small films, I mean, It Follows doesn't get the expansion without the 95% on Rotten Tomatoes that they're advertising.
And they are good. If I go there and I see what snippets they choose in my reviews, I'm like, yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. So there is, like Twitter, there's value in it to use it to find places. Don't use it as a be-all, end-all. Use it as a portal.
Right. Next, let's have another question here.
I thank you all for being here again. We were kind of talking about it already, how there's content out there nowadays as far as films go and criticism. There's platforms such as podcasts like Film Spotting or Ebert.com, people on YouTube like Chris Stuckman. And I know Matt wrote a piece about should focus more of their writing on the filmmaking aspect of everything, which I totally agreed with. Roger Ebert did this wonderfully, and regardless of whether or not you agreed with the opinion, it can legitimize a review, I think, and it shows a critical approach to it and a knowledgeable and caring perspective. So I was wondering about the importance of this sort of thing and I guess the state of it going forward, since you were saying people sometimes don't necessarily read the full review.
Right. We were talking about column length and the amount of room you had. Something that has gone out the window, as Matt wrote about, is talking about the formal elements of movies. And I think, quite honestly, that may be something I'm not going to say I'm responsible for, but young people, I don't know. There is a tendency among my generation to write about the emotions, which is fine, write about yourself and write about your responses to the movie and not talk about the sort of nitty-gritty, I think Matt called it the nuts and bolts of film, which is dangerous.
Well, the point of that piece, and I really wasn't trying, I actually lost a few friends over that piece, which surprised me, but the point I make was that I think the big danger of social media and of the internet culture in general is to reduce everything to an extension of our own feelings. And those are very important, and obviously they're at the center of every individual's life, but there's more to art than how I feel about it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there are formal properties that you can look at that are not just dry academic things, but they sort of tell you how the art form is evolving, and what is being said is often inextricably linked to how it is being said, and how an actor is photographed, how a camera is positioned, what sort of music is used. All you got to do is look at a political ad to see how an absolutely unremarkable photograph of someone can be made to seem sinister by removing the color or zooming in on it or adding a screeching violin, And this happens all the time, and it happens on television shows, it happens on TV news, it happens in major motion pictures, it happens, in those little bumper ads that you see when you watch something on YouTube. And the reason I talk about that is because I feel like we need to learn a little better how to watch things, like how to watch things critically. And it's not just a matter of keeping our ears attuned, but also how to spot things that are messages that we don't necessarily recognize as messages because they're being delivered in a subtle and sometimes insidious way.
Yeah, I'm always fond of quoting something that the great critic Manny Farber said in an interview, in, I think it was in the late 70s, where he said, the last thing I want to know is whether you liked it or not. The problems of criticism come after that. And I think that's a good philosophy to have. I'm very uninterested to know, really, if somebody liked something, they didn't like it. I think, you know, what Matt's talking about, how something is working, that's really what's interesting about criticism, to kind of get under the hood, as it were. You know?
Yeah, assessment is not really the true function.
One more quick question, if we would have the gentleman from back here come up.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, this will be the last question.
Thank you guys so much. I appreciate you being here. Rob Burgess from the Kokomo Tribune, but I just wanted to know, you guys were talking about social media, and I'm sure like a lot of you guys started before any of the internet was even a thing, and when you were writing, it wasn't a...
How dare you, sir?
I am purely a child of the internet.
But anyway, when you're writing something and there was no internet, there's no immediate feedback, so there's not as much of an incentive to be, I don't know, get some sort of, you know, feedback, either negative or positive. And I feel like now, even if you don't mean to, it influences you because you get that little endorphin rush, dopamine in your brain, and you're, oh, I feel that, and you know what I mean? That might influence your writing. I just wanted to know if that has happened to you guys. Do you feel like your writing has changed at all? Because, yeah.
I actually wrote a review. I screened Black or White when we get our end-of-year screeners, the Mike Binder movie. So I screened it in December. A couple of months before, I had tweeted a review because it was shown at the National Association of Black Journalists. But yeah, I watched it in December, and you know, I sent a tweet out or whatever, and I was just like, I didn't like this movie. And then I think it was the night of the Golden Globes. They showed a commercial for Black or White, and I was like, yeah, go see Selma instead. Mike Binder was on Twitter, and he immediately hit me up, and he was like, well, you can't call yourself a real film critic if you say all these things. And I was like, okay, well, I wasn't gonna write a review about this movie. So, yeah, you know what I mean? And so, I mean, you know, just kind of jumping on what you said before, as far as, you know, writing about filmmaking, the criticism is important as far as the form, but I admit, too, that filmmakers do have an agenda. Yeah. You know, there are social agendas, there are political agendas, and so I wanted to talk about that, you know, and so, yeah, I mean, and there are actors and actresses on Twitter who have hit me up where I may review a movie, and they're like, well, I didn't appreciate what you said, and blah, 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 but I mean, that's my job. I mean, that's not, you know.
And it depends. I mean, you were blessed in this sense because the agenda of Black or White was so upfront from the very beginning of Mike Binder saying, I have an opinion about race relations, and I think it's very valid. Thank you. And
yep.
it just comes at you with that level of tough white guy. Mm-hmm. Why aren't you listening to me? I've done some thinking about this. You know?
Yeah.
It was a white-splaining movie. Huh? White-splaining.
White-splaining, yeah. And I found it very interesting that the only people that he was hitting up on Twitter were critics of color and women of color. I noticed that there were other critics, you know, white, you know, or white film critics. He said nothing to them, but for some reason he just had this thing where if somebody...
I did get an unpleasant direct message from him.
Oh, you did? Oh,
he was very...
Our next panel, direct messages from Mike Binder.
I'll tell you a very quick anecdote about feedback, and this was when I was with Roger backstage at a television show once, and an actor came up to him and his movie, and he said, you don't understand, I spent 2 years of my life working on this movie. And Roger said, I spent 2 hours of my life watching what you did with that movie.
That's a good place to wind up. Thanks to everybody up here. Thanks to the critics, and thanks to you out there.
I almost feel bad for Mike Binder. You know, his whole